911, what's your emergency? A frantic, breathless voice crackles through the phone line. They're dead. All of them. Someone came in and, oh God, there's so much blood. The woman's voice is barely coherent, gasping between words, her breathing ragged, uneven. The dispatcher tries to calm her, asking for her name. A pause, then a whisper. Vespara Holloway, please. I think they're still in the house. The line goes eerily quiet. Only the sound of her shaky breathing remains. When police arrive minutes later, they are met with a scene out of a nightmare. The Holloway family home, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Ravenshire, is in total darkness. The front door is slightly ajar, creaking as the wind pushes against it. Inside, the house is unnervingly still. Too still. No movement, no voices, just the distant hum of a refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the foyer. Then, a flash of red, blood, splattered across the marble floor. A trail of it leads deeper into the house. One by one, officers begin to discover the bodies. Dr. Phineas Holloway found slumped over his desk, his face frozen in an expression of terror. His wife Eleanor, lying motionless in the living room, her hand still clutching a family photo, now stained with blood. The children, Ezric, Oren, Sylvienne, and little Odette, all found in their rooms, their beds soaked in crimson. 6 members of the Holloway family, massacred in their own home. And yet, in the midst of this carnage, there is one survivor. Vespara Holloway. She is discovered in the pantry, curled into a fetal position, her body trembling uncontrollably. Blood is smeared across her arms, her face, her clothes, yet none of it seems to be her own. Her expression is blank, her eyes wide with something between terror and shock. When officers lift her to her feet, she barely responds. They escort her outside, past the sea of flashing police lights, the growing crowd of curious onlookers, and the gurneys being rolled inside. To the world, she is a survivor, the only survivor. But as investigators begin to piece together the events of that night, something isn't adding up. The timeline is inconsistent. The crime scene doesn't match her story. The evidence, what little there is, raises more questions than answers. Was Vespara truly the victim of an unthinkable tragedy? Or was she the one responsible for the horror inside the Holloway home? Before we go deeper, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. This story will leave you speechless. Ravenshire was a town where secrets whispered through the streets, buried beneath a facade of wealth and prestige. It was the kind of place where reputations meant everything, where a single scandal could destroy a family's standing overnight. The Holloways were at the pinnacle of this world, respected, admired, untouchable. Dr. Phineas Holloway was not just a man of science. He was a savior in the eyes of the town. As the head neurosurgeon at Ravenshire Medical Center, he had saved lives, commanded respect, and built an empire of influence. Patients swore by his skills. Colleagues envied his precision. His name alone carried weight in the community, and with it came a level of power few dared to challenge. His wife, Eleanor, was the epitome of grace and sophistication. A former concert pianist, she had once filled grand halls with music that could move even the coldest hearts. But she had left that world behind to become the perfect matriarch, devoted, poised, an unwavering pillar of the Holloway dynasty. Eleanor wasn't just loved, she was worshipped. Her charity work, her elaborate galas, her presence at every town function, she had woven herself into the very fabric of Ravenshire's elite. Together, they had built a family that mirrored their success. Ezric Holloway, the eldest son, had followed in his father's footsteps, pursuing law with the same relentless ambition that had built the Holloway empire. He was sharp, methodical, and dangerously intelligent, a man whose name carried just as much weight in the courtroom as his father's did in the operating room. Oren Holloway, the second son, was the thinker, a quiet genius. He had spent his life buried in books, pursuing a doctorate in psychology. He was the kind of person who analyzed everything. Expressions, movements, the unspoken words between sentences. If anyone had noticed something amiss within the family, it would have been him. Sylvienne Holloway was different. Where her brothers had pursued academia, she had chosen a world of movement and art. A gifted ballet dancer, she was elegance personified, light on her feet, but determined. She had always been the free spirit, the one who saw beauty where others saw expectation. And then there was Odette. At just 14 years old, she was the youngest, the golden child, the one everyone adored. She had inherited her mother's musical talent, filling the Holloway estate with the soft melodies of her violin. She was the embodiment of innocence. The idea that anyone could harm her was unthinkable. To the world, the Holloways were perfect. But perfection is often an illusion. Behind the doors of their grand estate, something had been unraveling for years. Secrets, betrayals, tensions that had been carefully hidden beneath polished smiles and well-rehearsed pleasantries. And at the center of it all stood the one person who had never quite belonged, Vespara Holloway. From the moment she was born, Vespara had been different. She was neither the prodigy nor the perfectionist. She did not excel like her siblings, nor did she fit into the meticulously crafted mold her parents had designed for their children. She was rebellious, restless, unpredictable. She questioned rules that were meant to be followed. She rejected the expectations that had been placed upon her before she could even walk. And in a family like the Holloways, that was unacceptable. Phineas saw her as a failure, an embarrassment to the family name. While he had sculpted his other children into near-perfect reflections of himself, Vespara remained flawed. She had been expelled from private schools, arrested for minor offenses as a teenager, and spent more time drifting between failed jobs than building a respectable future. Eleanor, ever the composed matriarch, had tried to correct her. Tutors, etiquette lessons, forced smiles at dinner parties. But no amount of refinement could erase Vespara's defiance. Her siblings had their own opinions of her. Ezric viewed her with cold indifference. She was a stain on the Holloway reputation. Orrin studied her like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Sylvian, ever the peacekeeper, tried to connect with her, but Vespara pushed her away. And Odette. Odette was different. She was the only one who still looked up to Vespara, the only one who didn't see her as a disgrace, the only one who believed that deep down, her sister was good. Perhaps that was why, on the night of the massacre, Odette's death was the most brutal of all. Ravenshire whispered many things about the Holloways, but there were some truths that never made it beyond the walls of their estate. Financially, they appeared untouchable, but behind closed doors, Phineas had been drowning in gambling debts. He had masked them well, moving money through private accounts, shifting investments. But the numbers didn't lie. The Holloway fortune was bleeding out. Then there were the affairs. Eleanor knew. She always knew. But she played her role, looking the other way as Phineas indulged in his extracurricular activities. And the siblings. They weren't as close as the public believed. Ezric and Orrin had been in a bitter dispute over inheritance rights. Sylvienne had been planning to leave the family altogether, and Odette. Odette had discovered something she wasn't meant to know. Something about Vespara. Something that, had she lived long enough to reveal, would have changed everything. The Holloways had always survived their secrets. They had always found a way to bury the ugliness beneath their perfect image, until the night of the massacre, until 6 members of the Holloway family were found slaughtered in their own home, until the only survivor was Vespara, and until detectives started uncovering the cracks in her story. Because the more they investigated, the more one terrifying possibility became clear. Maybe Vespara wasn't a victim. Maybe she had been planning this for a very, very long time. It was a cold November night in Ravenshire, the kind of night where the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the Holloway estate. The grand mansion stood in eerie stillness on the outskirts of town, its towering iron gates shut tight, as if trying to guard the horrors that were about to unfold inside. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the first sound of disturbance was recorded. A neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, who lived 3 houses down, later told police she heard a faint thud, like something heavy hitting the floor, but dismissed it as nothing. 12:02 a.m. More sounds, a muffled scream, then silence. By the time the authorities arrived, it was already too late. The call came in at 12:31 a.m. A female voice, frantic, trembling, barely coherent. "They're dead! They're all dead! Please, you have to help me!" Dispatch traced the call to Holloway Manor. 3 patrol cars were dispatched. Officer Darnell Tully, one of the first responders, later described what he saw when they arrived. "The front door was wide open. That's never a good sign. But it was what I saw inside that'll haunt me forever." The once pristine marble floors of the Holloway estate were drenched in blood. It glistened under the soft chandelier lights, smeared across the hallways, dripping down the grand staircase. The heavy scent of iron filled the air. The silence was deafening. Then they found them. 6 bodies. Dr. Phineas Holloway was in his study, slumped over his mahogany desk, a single gunshot wound to the head. Papers were scattered around him, some soaked in his own blood. His reading glasses lay shattered on the floor. Eleanor Holloway was in the parlor, sprawled across the piano she once played so gracefully, a deep gash across her throat, her pearl necklace tangled in the sticky crimson. The music sheets, still spread open in front of her, were stained with splatters of red. Ezric Holloway was in the hallway leading to the bedrooms. His body had fallen mid-run, as if he had tried to escape. His injuries were more violent. Deep stab wounds to his chest, his right hand nearly severed, a look of sheer terror frozen on his lifeless face. Orrin Holloway was found in his room, his lifeless body hunched over his desk. Much like his father, he had defensive wounds on his arms, suggesting he had fought back, but it hadn't been enough. A single bullet to the temple had ended his life. Sylviane Holloway had been hiding. They found her in the upstairs bathroom, the door locked from the inside. She had tried to barricade herself, pushing the vanity dresser against the door. It hadn't saved her. The killer had broken through, leaving behind deep axe-like gashes across her torso. The mirror, still intact, bore a single eerie message written in blood. She knew. But it was Odette's death that sent a chill through even the most seasoned detectives. Her violin lay beside her, untouched. The sheet music in front of her was still open, as if, before the horror began, she had been playing, lost in the melody. She had been the last to die, the most brutal of all. Strangled. Her body was carefully placed on her bed, her hands folded neatly over her stomach, and her eyes, they were open, staring, not in fear, but almost as if she knew. The Ravenshire Police Department wasted no time launching a full-scale investigation into the Holloway massacre. 6 people dead, 1 survivor, and an entire town demanding answers. At first, the working theory was straightforward: a violent home invasion gone wrong. A ruthless intruder had entered the Holloway estate, slaughtered the family, and somehow left Vespara alive. But as detectives dug deeper, cracks in that theory began to emerge, and soon the case that seemed so open and shut would become something else entirely. It made sense at first. The Holloways were wealthy, powerful, influential, a target for robbery, perhaps even a vendetta killing. The town was in a panic. If an unknown assailant could break into the most secure home in Ravenshire and execute an entire family, who was next? The police assured the public they were working on all leads, but behind closed doors, doubts were already growing. Because the crime scene didn't look like a home invasion. No forced entry. The security system wasn't disabled. It was never triggered. Whoever did this had either entered with a key or was let inside. The family wasn't bound or restrained. A burglar would have subdued them first. But the Holloways were killed systematically, one by one, as if the killer had all the time in the world. Nothing was stolen. Expensive jewelry, cash, and electronics, all untouched. So if this wasn't a robbery, what was it? From the beginning, something about Vespara's version of events seemed off. She claimed she had been asleep in her room when she was suddenly awakened by the sound of gunfire. She hid in a closet, frozen with fear, until the house fell silent. But detectives started noticing small contradictions. She said she never saw the attacker, but in a later interview, she slipped, mentioning a figure moving down the hallway. She claimed she never left her room, but traces of her bloody footprints were found near 3 separate bodies. She swore she never touched her family members, but her fingerprints were on Phineas's gun, the murder weapon used on her father and brother. And then there was her demeanor. In the days following the massacre, Vespara cried during interviews. She trembled when she spoke, but her tears never seemed real. Veteran detective Samuel Greaves, who had worked homicides for 20 years, later described his first impression of her. She did everything a grieving survivor was supposed to do. The right words, the right emotions, but something about it felt rehearsed, like she was performing, like she had studied how to act like a victim. And then came the biggest red flag. Investigators had been meticulously combing through the Holloway estate, analyzing every room, every surface. And that's when they noticed it. One of the ground floor windows had been shattered from the inside. Glass fragments were scattered on the lawn, not inside the house. If someone had broken in, the glass should have fallen inward. Forensic teams also found no footprints outside the window, no sign that anyone had entered through that opening at all. It was staged. Someone had smashed the window after the killings to make it look like a break-in. Someone inside the house. Someone like Vespara. Crime scene analysts spent days reconstructing the timeline of the killings, using blood spatter analysis to determine who was attacked first, how they moved, and where the killer went next. And the results were damning. The pattern of blood on Vespara's clothes didn't match her story. She claimed she had hidden the entire time, but if that were true, she should have only had passive blood transfer from hugging a victim after the fact. Instead, her clothes had high-velocity blood spatter, the kind that only happens when you're near the point of impact. The position of the bodies suggested a level of familiarity. The killer knew how to navigate the house without hesitation. The forensic team knew what they were looking at. This wasn't the work of a stranger. The killer had walked through the house calmly, deliberately, as if they belonged there, as if they lived there, as if it was never supposed to be a break-in at all. And suddenly, the lone survivor didn't look so innocent anymore. With mounting evidence, detectives decided it was time to bring Vespara back in, not as a witness, but as a suspect. She sat across from them in the cold, gray interrogation room. Her hands trembled as she took a sip of water. Detective Greaves leaned forward. "Vespara, we need you to tell us the truth. We know the break-in was staged. We know the timeline doesn't add up. Help us understand what really happened that night." She froze. For a long moment, she just stared. Then, instead of answering, she smiled and whispered 4 chilling words. "What took you so long? Before we uncover the shocking truth behind Vespara's eerie confession, make sure you're subscribed and have hit the notification bell, because what happens next is beyond anything you can imagine." The twist. Vespara's secret exposed. For weeks, the town of Ravenshire had been gripped by the horrifying Holloway massacre. 6 lives lost in one of the most brutal family slayings the community had ever seen. One survivor, Vespara Holloway. But now, detectives had a different narrative forming. Vespara wasn't the victim she claimed to be. She was something else entirely. And what investigators were about to uncover would shock even the most seasoned detectives. The first breakthrough came from her digital footprint. In cases like these, investigators always seize devices. Phones, laptops, desktops. Vespara's personal MacBook, found in her bedroom, was sent for forensic analysis. And when they retrieved her search history, everything changed. She had deleted her recent searches. But digital footprints don't vanish so easily. Investigators recovered weeks' worth of searches, and what they found was chilling. How to fake a home invasion and not get caught. How long does it take to bleed out from a stab wound? What are the best ways to kill someone quietly? Can forensic experts tell if a window was broken from the inside? How much blood loss is fatal? Fastest way to delete security footage. She had been planning, calculating, mapping out every step of the crime before it even happened. And then, something even more damning. A Reddit thread. Vespara had posted anonymously under a burner account. Investigators traced it back to her IP address. The title? "Has anyone ever gotten away with murdering their entire family?" One of the replies to her post read, "If you make it look like a robbery gone wrong, it's possible." And beneath it, Vespara had responded, "Good to know. Thanks." This wasn't spur of the moment. This was premeditation. And yet, it still wasn't enough to arrest her. Not yet. They needed more. And they were about to get it. Ravenshire was a quiet town. But in wealthier neighborhoods like the Holloway estate, home security was a priority. Nearly every house on their street had some form of surveillance, including the Holloways themselves. There were multiple cameras on the property. However, on the night of the murders, something strange happened. All cameras inside the Holloway house had been shut off at 10:47 p.m. manually, by someone with access to the system, by someone inside. But detectives weren't giving up. They canvassed the area, collecting footage from neighboring houses, searching for any clue that might contradict Vespara's story. And then, they found it. A motion-activated security camera from across the street. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. 11:26 p.m. A figure stepped outside the Holloway estate. Not an intruder breaking in, but someone already inside. It was Vespara. She stood outside for a full 8 minutes, pacing, breathing heavily. Her hands were covered in something dark, something wet. Blood. She glanced around as if making sure no one was watching. Then, she walked back inside. Detectives compared the timestamp with the forensic time of death analysis, and the truth became unavoidable. She hadn't walked out before the murders. She had walked out after. Yes, because she was the one who did it. The final piece of the puzzle came from the financial records. Investigators had been digging into the Holloway family's assets, looking for any clues about a possible motive. And what they found was unexpected. A life insurance policy. Not just any policy, a multi-million-dollar payout. And the sole beneficiary, Vespara Holloway. The policy had been updated exactly 2 months before the murders. Not by Phineas Holloway. Not by Eleanor. By Vespara herself. She had forged signatures, altering the documents in secret, ensuring that if her entire family died, she would inherit everything. She wasn't just trying to get away with murder, she was trying to cash in on it. And now detectives had enough. The digital evidence, the staged crime scene, the altered life insurance policy, and the security footage proving she had been awake, alert, and moving through the house during the killings. They weren't dealing with a survivor. They were dealing with a predator. They didn't waste time. A warrant was issued. Vespara Holloway was arrested at 3:14 a.m. at a hotel outside of town. She was found in a luxury suite, drinking wine, watching the news coverage of her own crime. When detectives burst in, weapons drawn, she didn't fight. She didn't run. She simply put her glass down, looked up, and smiled. "Took you long enough." The exact same words she had said in her first interrogation, as if this was all just a game to her. But what came next was even more disturbing, because at trial, Vespara would reveal something no one saw coming. And trust me, you're not ready for what she had to say. So before we continue, make sure you're subscribed and have hit the notification bell. The next part of this case will leave you speechless. The arrest of Vespara Holloway sent shockwaves through Ravenshire. A survivor turned killer. The woman who stood before cameras crying, pleading for justice for her slaughtered family, now exposed as the mastermind behind their deaths. And the public? They couldn't get enough of it. News vans lined the streets. True crime podcasts, online forums, and national news networks latched onto the story, dissecting every detail. Headlines were relentless. Holloway heiress from orphan to murderer. Family massacre survivor, orchestrator of the slaughter. Blood money. Did Vespara kill for millions? Reporters swarmed the courthouse every time Vespara was transported for hearings, and yet she never looked rattled. No tears, no panic, just an eerie, composed expression. She didn't shrink from the cameras. She smiled, as if she enjoyed the attention. She had fooled the world once. And now the question remained, would she do it again in court? It was standing room only inside the courtroom. Prosecutors were relentless. They painted her as a cold-blooded sociopath who meticulously planned the massacre for financial gain. They walked the jury through her Google searches, the staged crime scene, the life insurance fraud. They played security footage showing Vespara leaving the house after the killings. The motive was clear. She wanted the Holloway fortune, and she didn't want to share it. But the defense, they had a different story. And no one was ready for what Vespara's lawyers were about to reveal. The defense claimed Vespara wasn't the mastermind. She was the victim. They introduced something never seen before, a second suspect, someone Vespara had never mentioned, someone else who stood to benefit from the Holloway family's deaths, a man who had been in and out of her life since she was a teenager, a man linked to unsolved violent crimes in multiple states, a man whose fingerprints were also found at the scene. His name, Lucian Graves. And when the defense pulled up his mugshot, the gallery gasped. Because this wasn't just anyone. This was Vespara's former lover. And according to her attorneys, he was the real killer. The court fell silent as Vespara took the stand. She wore black. Her hair, usually immaculate, was disheveled. Her expression? Haunted. Then, in a soft, trembling voice, she began to speak. "I didn't kill them," she whispered. "I tried to stop him." She detailed a secret relationship with Lucian Graves, how he had been manipulating her for years, how he had a violent temper, how he had threatened to kill her family if she didn't do exactly as he said. "He told me to make it look like a robbery," she sobbed. "He told me to lie to the police." The jury watched as Vespara broke down, tears, shaking hands. She pleaded with them to believe her, and some of them did. The prosecution, however, wasn't convinced. "If Lucian Graves committed these murders," the prosecutor said coldly, "where is he now?" A beat of silence. Then Vespara looked up and smirked. "That's a good question." After weeks of relentless arguments, the jury was finally sent to deliberate. Would they see Vespara as a victim or a cold-blooded killer? Days passed. The public waited, breathless. And then the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent. Vespara Holloway stood motionless as the judge read the verdict. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant not guilty." The gasps were deafening. Some jurors wept. The Holloway family's remaining relatives screamed in outrage. "Vespara!" She just smiled. She had won. She had fooled everyone. Or had she? Because as she walked out of the courtroom, free, a reporter called out, "Vespara, where is Lucian Graves now?" And without missing a beat, he turned, met his eyes, and whispered, "Who says he ever existed?" But was this really justice, or had the world just let a murderer walk free? There's one final twist in this story, and trust me, it changes everything. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't believe what happens next. The case of Vespara Holloway remains one of the most twisted, chilling, and debated cases in recent history. A grieving survivor turned prime suspect, turned free woman. But even now, long after the trial has ended, people still ask, did she really get away with murder? Or was she telling the truth all along? Imagine trusting someone completely, only to find out they were planning your demise. The Holloway family never saw it coming. 6 lives, erased in one brutal night. A daughter who cried for justice, only to be exposed as the mastermind. And then, just when the world thought it had her figured out, she turned the tables again. She walked free. No remorse, no confession, just a haunting smirk, and the possibility that she was never alone in this crime. Or worse, that she had played everyone from the start. Criminologists, psychologists, and even armchair detectives have obsessed over this case. What makes someone like Vespara capable of such horror? Was she a manipulative mastermind, a cold-blooded killer who plotted the perfect crime only to outsmart the system? Or was she a pawn, a victim of a far more sinister influence, someone who was conditioned, coerced, and ultimately framed? Experts have weighed in. Some say Vespara fit the profile of a high-functioning psychopath, charming, intelligent, and completely void of empathy. Others argue that her story about Lucian Graves wasn't entirely impossible, that there were gaps in the investigation, that maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth. But if Lucian existed, why had no one ever seen him? Why had no trace of him ever surfaced? And why did Vespara never seem concerned about him coming back for her? In one of her last known public appearances, Vespara was asked a simple but chilling question by a journalist. If you could say one thing to your family today, what would it be? She paused. Then, in a voice calm, almost playful, she simply said, "I wish they had trusted me more." And then she walked away, smiling, never looking back. Was Vespara truly evil, or was there more to the story? Was she a criminal mastermind, or an innocent woman caught in a nightmare? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this case chilling, like this video and subscribe for more shocking true crime stories. Because trust me, the next one, it's even darker.